This is Autism Points of View by Autism Speaks. I'm Felipe Maya. There are always topics in any community that aren't universally agreed upon, and the autism community is no different. Because autism is considered a spectrum disorder, that means that each person on the spectrum largely has an experience uniquely their own. Some have incredible intelligence and talents that they can turn into a career, while others struggle to find ways to express their wants and needs. Some are able to live fulfilling, independent lives, while others require round-the-clock lifelong care. When I speak about a person's strengths, I just want to make it clear that even though someone with autism may have many talents, it doesn't mean they don't also have challenges. The same goes for those with profound challenges. It doesn't mean they don't also have great strengths. Then there are the family members and friends who see autism through their loved one's experience. The autism community also involves a large network of professionals like educators, therapists, and researchers. I could go on and on about the diversity of the autism community, but the point is, all experiences should be respected. One topic that often quickly turns into a debate is how we talk about autism. There are two ways we typically do this. They're called person-first language and identity-first language. Person-first language does just that. It separates the person from their diagnosis. So you would say, I have autism, or my son or daughter has autism. Identity-first language makes the diagnosis a part of the person's identity. So you would say, I am autistic, or my son or daughter is autistic. In this episode, you'll hear from a variety of perspectives throughout the autism community, from autistic adults to parents to professionals. Let's start by breaking this topic down a bit more with a Delphi University professor and Autism Speaks board member, Dr. Stephen Shore.
There are some factions in the autism community. One of those areas of division is actually person versus identity first language. So, for example, I consider myself as an autistic individual. That's identity first language. So those of us who do use identity first language, we feel that autism colors every aspect of our lives, but at the same time, it's not all who we are. And considering that autism isn't a bad thing, it just kind of is, then why not just be autistic as opposed to person first? Now, getting to person first language, there's a number of reasons that people prefer person first language. And that is to honor the person's humanity first, recognize that individual as a person who happens to have something. Originally, people did use identity first language, but you might say for the wrong reasons. And we'd hear medical professionals and educators talk about the retard date in room 201, for example, which was a very disrespectful way of talking about people who we now term as having intellectual disabilities. The R word is disappearing, otherwise known as retardation, because it has gained so much stigma that it's really not usable anymore.
In 1974, the first self-advocacy conference was held in the US. During the conference, a man spoke about being labeled as mentally retarded, the diagnosis at the time for anyone with an intellectual disability. His words sparked a movement. He said, I want to be known as a person first. Robert Nassif is a clinical psychologist and author, and he experienced this cultural shift firsthand. His son Tariq was diagnosed with autism and intellectual disability in 1984 when he was 5 years old.
I'd say when my son was born, person first language was just kind of coming in, I think. And it was a relief to me because of how stigmatizing the identity language was, because since he had cognitive disability, he was called retarded. So that kind of horrified me, and the person-first language, which celebrated his humanity, was a relief.
Tariq is now 39 and nonverbal, meaning he doesn't speak, but he's able to communicate his needs and wants in other ways. And while growing up, he was never able to let his dad know how he would like to identify, Robert formed his opinion from his involvement in the autism community.
Things started changing, and I started, understanding him better and the world of autism and special needs better. I've come to prefer identity first language, and I've learned a lot of that, and I've been influenced by the self-advocates. We don't talk about people as being a person with Italianism or a person with Arab Americanism, such as myself. We talk about, we can't really separate ourselves from our identity questions. So, and autism isn't really separable from the person. And yet, not every person with autism prefers identity first language, and I think that's fine. I think we need to respect and honor, everyone, and that's really the main thing. But language does play a role in societal attitudes, and what I've come to see is that people in groups such as the autistic, the blind, and the deaf tend to prefer identity first, whereas people in the parent and professional groups tend to prefer person first, although, that's changing over, probably right as we speak even.
Many autistic advocates in the neurodiversity movement prefer identity first language. The concept of neurodiversity was first introduced in the late 90s. It views autism not as a disorder, but as a natural genetic variation. But like Robert's son Tariq, not all people with autism are able to express how they would like to identify. Amy Kelly is a family and community services director and mom to 17-year-old Annie, who has autism and intellectual and developmental disabilities.
I prefer person-centered language or person-first language. And as a mother, I prefer that. So my daughter is profoundly affected by autism and has limited language, verbal skills. I mean, she communicates well with her iPad, but I'm essentially her outward voice. And I noticed years ago when, after her diagnosis, people didn't really know how to talk about autism around her or even ask the questions. So I just found I was getting almost offended when they would say, well, she's autistic. And I thought, gosh, Annie's so much more than her autism. And that's sort of what started me as a parent, understanding that. And then in my professional role, I've had to learn much more about language around disabilities. And I have found that I'm much more comfortable and prefer and model person-centered language. Just like autism is very different in every person, I think every person, has their own opinion about this, especially if they are someone that can speak about having autism and self-advocate. It's totally their right to call themselves autistic.
A 2015 UK study published in the journal Autism of nearly 3,500 people with autism, their family members and friends, as well as professionals, showed that autistic people and their loved ones largely preferred identity-first language. Here's Bridget Rankowski, autistic educator and circus performer.
Well, I know a few people who are people living with autism because they've decided to name their cat Autism. So they are living with autism. But as someone who jumps in the professional, personal spheres and stuff, I'm very well versed in this topic. And I am autistic. It's part of my identity. I view the world through the autism lens. And what other people have sometimes brought up is look at the number of words people sometimes place between the word person and autism. And think about that distance and understanding that, yes, we are all people, but some of us are autistic and there's nothing wrong with it. I think I've seen a lot of parents and professionals who even fight me for how I refer to myself. And that goes along with the gender lines of, okay, but this is how a person is choosing to identify, and it's important to respect that. I choose to use identity first language because that's how I identify. It's part of my identity. When I do presentations and speeches, I'll sometimes switch between the two purely because that's how my brain works and it's a jumble. But I see a